All right, friends. Our guest today is Michel. He's a writer, analyst, and investigative journalist working on topics ranging from kleptocracy, illicit finance, and foreign interference to developments in the post-Soviet space and dark money financing networks. His first book, which is the topic of our conversation today, is American Kleptocracy. I want to tell you why I wanted to reach out to Casey and have a conversation with him today. So many of the conversations that we're having right now about American inequality, about the war that Putin's Russia has waged on Ukraine, about the future of our democratic governance. All of these sort of come back to a central theme about whether or not we can actually hold policymakers accountable and the porousness between our economic system and our political system. So much of that comes back to kleptocracy. And that's why we're honored today to have my guest, Michel, join us. Casey, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Abdul, great to be here.
Yeah, really appreciate you coming. I want to jump right in. What motivated you to write a book about kleptocracy?
Boy, that's a great question. Still not quite sure how I ended up here, to say nothing of the fact that certainly kleptocracy and things like how oligarchs move and hide and launder all of their money across places like the United States of America became quite as relevant as it has certainly over the past month or so. I mean, the short answer, the quick answer is I was actually a Peace Corps volunteer in the country of Kazakhstan years ago, about a decade ago. And that's my first time working and living in a country overseen by a regime that we would describe as a kleptocratic dictatorship. That's really what sparked my interest in how that country operated, where the dictator and his family moved and hid and laundered all of their money. And it so happens to be that they like to turn to Western jurisdiction after Western jurisdiction to do so. And time and again, it just so happened that their shell companies, their offshore networks, and beyond that, their influence campaigns ended up right here in the United States of America. So I didn't dedicate the book to the now former dictator of Kazakhstan himself, Nursultan Nazarbayev, but boy, he was kind of on my right behind my shoulder as I was writing this whole book. That's what sparked all of this interest in the post-Soviet space, in post-Soviet oligarchs, and then beyond that, modern kleptocracy itself. So thank you to former President Nazarbayev for sparking that interest for me.
You know, it's ironic, right? You went from the United States to Kazakhstan to help, and a lot of the roads led back to the United States. All of the ways in which somebody like Nazarbayev can hide his money, create a pool of assets that steals from the people of Kazakhstan, that create the hole that you sought to fill as a Peace Corps volunteer. And you see the sort of circularity, the ways that these systems are self-reinforcing. I want to ask you, I actually did some work in Kazakhstan back when I was a researcher looking at tuberculosis rates. Were you in Almaty or were you elsewhere?
I was in Almaty for a few months doing my training, and then I was actually up right near the Kazakh-Russian border, which, again, has become far more relevant in terms of potential interest than it's frankly should have ever been. But I was in a small village up north of the capital.
I bring it up because, you know, when we were looking at tuberculosis rates, tuberculosis is a structural disease. It's one of those diseases that you can keep down if people are well fed enough, if they live in ventilated environments, if you can address all of the circumstances of poverty that tend to spread it. And in a society that makes as much money as Kazakhstan makes, you see so little actually go to the people, and that drives rates of things like tuberculosis, which I'm sure when you were there, you probably saw.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're exactly right. When we're talking about this oligarchic or despotic or kleptocratic money laundering systems, and again, when we're talking about kleptocracy, it's not just one regime in one place in one country. It's this transnational phenomenon. All of this illicit or questionable or suspect wealth flowing from countries like Kazakhstan, tied to regimes like those we see in that country and around the world, into, again, Western and especially the United States of America, Western jurisdictions, and especially the U.S. It is this transnational phenomenon. But in a certain way, there's still this view that money laundering, international money laundering, kleptocratic regimes like this, they're moving billions and potentially trillions of dollars in illicit wealth. And that's obviously horrible, but maybe it's not quite the same thing as brutality or bloodshed like we're seeing in Ukraine. There's still this idea that money laundering itself is this kind of victimless crime. But Abdul, as you just mentioned, this money was supposed to have gone somewhere else. It was supposed to have gone to the hospitals, to the health infrastructure, to schools, to roads, to the basic building blocks of life, to say nothing of other kind of positive investments elsewhere. And because that money has been stolen by these ruling regimes, because that has been allocated to these oligarchs, to the dictators and their families themselves, and then obviously ends up in places like the United States of America, where it's freely and legally laundered and has been for years and years, things like tuberculosis run rampant. Things like other diseases, things like housing problems, things like wealth inequality only continue to spiral. As you mentioned at the outset, Abdul, it is this interconnected web. That means that modern kleptocracy, modern transnational money laundering with the U.S. at the center is anything but a victimless crime. Go to country after country, region after region, jurisdiction after jurisdiction, and you will find the same story. Kazakhstan is not an outlier. It is the kind of canary in the coal mine for how modern kleptocracy works.
Yeah, you make a really important point. If you're stealing the money that otherwise would have built a healthcare system for people in your society, you are leaving those people without the healthcare that they need and deserve and can afford, but for your kleptocracy. I want to jump in and actually just offer some definitions here. And I'm going to ask you to define kleptocracy, right? Because klepto, we think about as stealing. Ocracy is the people who run the countries. When the people who run the country steal. Is that right? Or is there something more to kleptocracy as we think about it, as you define it in your book?
Sure. No, I mean, Abdul, you're absolutely right. That is the technical term. That is what we traditionally understand as kleptocracy. It's a single regime. It's a single ruling class dedicated not to democracy, not to economic growth, dedicated only to enriching themselves, their family members, their friends, and other oligarchs around them. We still use kleptocracy to mean that. So if we're talking about Russia, for instance, it's still a kleptocratic regime with a ruling figure in Putin dedicated to enriching himself and those around him. But as I argue in the book, we can still use that term. We can still use kleptocracy to mean its literal a definition. But what I'm writing about, what I'd like to see more of in the kind of broader discourse is understanding kleptocracy, as I just mentioned a moment ago, as this international, this transnational phenomenon. When I'm talking about kleptocracy, I'm talking about illicit, suspect, ill-gotten wealth that transfers borders, that crosses borders, crosses jurisdictions, crosses hemispheres, that leaves that country of origin, because these kleptocrats, these kleptocratic regimes, no longer keep that money in the country itself. They no longer keep that money in the national banking sector or the national real estate sector or the national investment sector. Instead, they turn to international centers of finance. They turn to international networks. They turn to this broader transnational money laundering phenomenon that all too often has the United States of America as the center. And again, we could talk about some of those specific policies in the U.S. that transform the U.S. into the central role, the center player of this modern phenomenon. But when we're talking about kleptocracy today, I want to highlight this international, transnational phenomenon. This corruption, these kleptocratic regimes, that isn't something that simply happens over there. That isn't something that simply happens in the Kazakhstans or the Russia or the elsewheres of the world. It now enters into an international, transnational network that provides all of the tools of anonymity, all the tools of laundering that these kleptocratic and oligarchic figures need.
You know, Casey, as you think about that, my family's from Egypt. And when we think about the consequences of globalization, the sort of first wave of globalization was this long-term trade. And then, of course, you have colonialism, which is this movement of money from places like where my family come from in Egypt into places like France or the UK or even Turkey through the Ottoman Empire. And that is one way to sort of take money out of a space and concentrate it. But what you're laying out here is a 21st century version almost of colonialism, where we set up all of the industrial means for a kleptocrat to move their money across their state borders into our country to service our economy in ways. And in some respects, it's still that movement of money from poor people and poor places into rich countries to service very, very rich people. And it sort of is that 21st century parallel of colonialism.
No, I think that is a wonderful framing. I hope folks will take that to heart. And I would love to see more of that. There's actually a fantastic book that just came out earlier this month from a British investigative journalist named Oliver Bullough called Butler to the World, which is something of a British complement to my book. He examines the transformation of the United Kingdom as this post-imperial jurisdiction that nonetheless continues to suck up so much of this illicit and elite-connected wealth from former British imperial holdings and jurisdictions, to say nothing of the role that British overseas territories like the British Virgin Islands or the Cayman Islands, these other imperial outposts, continue to play in that. You know, I think, Gabriel, you're exactly right, is this kind of neo-colonialist outlook and system that has been set up. And we see most clearly within that the colonial framings of who is actually profiting, because it's not just those elite players, those dictatorial regimes, those oligarchs that are close to them. It's also these Western shell company providers. It's these Western real estate networks. It's these Western private equity and hedge fund managers. Western industry after Western industry, and again, especially in the United States of America, those are the ones that are profiting. Similar to the colonial structures that we saw of decades or centuries ago. It is these Western jurisdictions and these Western players and partners that are the ones that are profiting hand over fist, helping these elites in these other countries, these dictators, these oligarchs continue to pillage local populations.
So one of the points that you make in the book, which I really love, is that it's too big to see, right? This is the greatest money laundering scheme on earth, and it's too big to see. So first, how big is it? And then why can't we see it?
That is another fantastic question in terms of how big it actually is. I'll be honest, we have no idea because of the opacity, because of the anonymity, because of the rampant loopholes and exemptions. We can only run with basic estimates of what we're talking about in terms of the scope and the scale of the total offshoring world. Now, the best one that we have comes from a handful of economists that have studied this very, very closely, including a well-known one named Gabriel Zuckman, who estimated a few years ago that we're talking about anywhere between 15 and maybe $20 trillion in offshored wealth. You start talking about trillions, it kind of just disintegrates. You can't get a good handle on that. But for comparison's sake, that's about the same size as the GDP of China. So we're now talking about an invisible superpower with so much of that wealth offshored again in places like the United States of America. But that's only a basic estimate. I was actually running the numbers earlier this morning. In my book, I write about things like the American real estate sector, the American private investment sector, which have enjoyed decades-long exemptions from basic anti-money laundering concerns. We know have become wonderful and frequent sources of money laundering services for oligarchs from around the world. The American real estate sector is worth $65 trillion. The private investment sector is worth another 11 or 12 trillion dollars. All of that is not subject to any anti-money laundering requirement whatsoever. That all of that is subject to or allowing of the anonymous services that these kleptocratic figures need. We're talking tens of trillions of dollars that is perfectly open, and that's only one country among the broader West that is providing all of these services.
So can you walk us through how it is hidden, right? Because it seems like it should be impossible to hide trillions of dollars, and yet that's exactly what allows this kleptocracy world to go around.
Yeah.
How exactly is it hidden? And I want to just sort of note here that it is particular states in our country. You talk about Delaware in your book, and Nevada and South Dakota, and this race to the bottom among states to help these kleptocrats hide their money. Where does it go, and how does this work?
Yeah, so it's on the one hand, a relatively complicated, convoluted story because you have a lot of different moving parts. You have a lot of different what we call enablers, that is to say the Americans on the ground in the U.S. that are helping move this money. These are the lawyers, these are the real estate agents, these are the accountants. You can pick and choose any one of these different nodes that you want, but at the end of the day, it's a relatively simple process. These oligarchs, these kleptocrats are looking for one thing, and that's anonymity. And they find that all too often in things like shell companies and trusts in the United States of America. Because America is still structured as a federal polity, it's a federal republic. Washington, D.C. does not oversee the creation of shell companies or oversee the creation of trusts. Instead, it is the states like Delaware, states like Nevada, states like Wyoming, that are able to freely and legally create anonymous shell companies, anonymous trusts that they can then sell to these kleptocratic figures, these oligarchs. What that means is that even while these kleptocrats, even while these oligarchs now control a company on a piece of paper, while they now control a trust on a piece of paper, their name is never attached to it. All of a sudden, that wealth that is held by that company is stripped from its identifying source. You can't track it back to where it initially came from, to its initial crime, the initial pillaging, the initial oligarch himself. And from there, that money is then transformed into what we describe as legitimate assets or clean assets or licit assets. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about money laundering, which is really a simple transformation of dirty or questionable or suspect money into legitimate, licit, above board assets. And again, you have to get back to that middle component of the shell company, of the trust that strips the identifying information. As soon as that identifying information is stripped, they can move that money into a whole range of industries across the United States that, again, don't have any basic anti-money laundering checks. There's no requirements for real estate agents to check where that money came from. There's no requirement for high-end art gallery owners to check where that money came from. There's no requirement for yacht developers or luxury goods dealers to check where that money came from. And because they don't have to check where the initial source of that money, they can sell to any shell company. They can sell to any trust that they would like. And in so doing, that money flows from the original kleptocratic source into all of these trillion-dollar industries across the United States. Real estate, private equity, hedge funds, the art market, auction houses, on and on and on. We know time and again, these oligarchic figures these kleptocratic figures and regimes have plowed that money into these jurisdictions that are into these industries that enjoy and provide all the anonymity that they need and all the safety and security of the American rule of law that they need to make sure they can retain those assets for as long as they want.
So I want to get into why these industries are such havens for kleptocracy, but I want to zoom in for a second on the states themselves. Why would a state like, say, Delaware or Nevada want to get in on this? Like, why do you want to be the safe haven for kleptocrats all over the world? What's in it for them?
The short answer to that, Abdul, and again, it's a great question. The short answer is that what we have seen for decades now is that there is very simply a demand for these services. These kleptocratic figures and regimes and oligarchic figures around the world have spent years trying to find that anonymity, trying to find those anonymous investments to get their money out of those original source countries, because they never know when there's going to be some kind of revolution, when there's going to be a falling out with a local dictator, when that money they have stolen may in turn be stolen from them. They have been looking for safe havens for years and years. And I should say, in addition, we know that Western oligarchic figures and Western wealthy Westerners have been looking for similar systems as well. So they're following a similar pattern. Into the breach, realizing there is that demand there, you find these smaller states, these states that don't have much natural resource base, don't have much other economic base itself, not many other means of generating revenue itself. These are the states like Delaware, the states like Wyoming, the states like Nevada, the states like South Dakota, that over the past few decades have realized not only is the demand for all of these anonymous, all of these laundering services there from kleptocrats and oligarchs around the world, but beyond that, because the United States of America is a federal jurisdiction, they have the sovereign rights to create these shell companies, to provide these shell companies, provide these trusts to anyone who comes knocking. There is no federal regulation about who they can provide these shell companies to, provide these trusts to, provide all this anonymity to. And in so doing, they realize not only can they sell these new anonymous services, but they can take a slice of the profit as well. There can be registration fees, there can be annual fees, there can be even minimal taxes. What we've seen in Delaware now has more companies than it does constituents. That is to say, it has more companies than it does people on the ground. So in a very real sense, the legislators in Delaware, their primary constituents are no longer the voters, but the companies themselves. That is to say, they are now a captured state, similar to what we've seen in South Dakota, similar to what we've seen in Nevada and Wyoming. They become effectively captured by these industries that can then control the kind of regulatory requirements, can control the kind of loopholes and exemptions that kleptocrats elsewhere need. So kind of a convoluted, kind of a rambling answer to a very simple story. These are small states that realized the demand was there and they had it within their power to provide all of those anonymous services that those kleptocrats continue to need.
And the implicit piece here is that once you allow for anonymous individuals and organizations to create anonymous shell companies, those companies now, under the Citizens United case, those companies basically have 14th Amendment rights as individuals and First Amendment rights that render their money as speech. And so the point that you made about capture really does flow through the fact that because in this country, money is speech and corporations are people too, my friend, in the famous words of Mitt Romney, then they can then influence the state governments that have created these policies to keep them in this situation where they are in effect beholden to not just the wealth that they get through this illicit business, but then also through the lobbying that they're going to apply on state legislatures. Now, you build this Russian nesting doll of companies that all answer to other companies. Presumably, though, if you're like a mega billionaire who's ravaged your people to take their money and put that in the United States, like you don't just want to have it in the United States. You want to buy fancy stuff with it, and you might think that this would be a place where enterprising set of regulators could intervene and stop this from happening. But you really lay out in your book exactly how it is that there have been carve-outs in the policy regime that would have otherwise regulated this around things like real estate, fancy art, and big purchases. You talk about in particular an oligarch from a nation in West Africa who made a show of buying Michael Jackson memorabilia. In fact, was the biggest collector. He owned the famous glove. Why is it that we're not regulating this? I mean, what was the circumstance that, real estate got carved out?
Yeah, although that's I'm glad you bring up the Michael Jackson component to this. As depressing of a topic as it is, I'd like to think the book at least has some fun elements, or at least memorable elements that we can at least
It's
laugh at.
basically
And
to your
get
point.
back
It's
to.
extremely well written, and you make the issue of kleptocracy and all of the complexities of it come to life. So
Well,
kudos to
thank
you.
you. I appreciate it. And obviously, again, I appreciate it. It's an honor to join you today to talk about this topic, which is unfortunately near and dear to my heart at this point. But to answer your question, why is it that we have seen these decades-long exemptions for things like real estate, things like private equity investments, the art market, and on and on? For that answer, you kind of have to go back 20 years ago, 21 years ago now, after the September 11th attacks here in the U.S. It is absolutely wild. When I was researching this book, reading about the American banking sector in the 1990s, it was like the Wild West back then. You could bring a duffel bag full of cash into any American bank that you wanted. They could work with any shell bank that they wanted, which is a bank only on a piece of paper. You could be the dictator, him or herself, and come into an American bank and deposit your money there. What American legislators realized is, boy, oh boy, the American banking sector is wide open, and we don't actually want that to continue to be the case. We don't want that to potentially be used for any kind of terror financing network or any broader oligarchic network itself. So what we saw happen is after the September 11th attacks, there's a piece of legislation that was passed called the Patriot Act, which is certainly notorious for all of its civil liberties violations. What was fascinating to me is that the Patriot Act was, of all things, one of the most progressive pieces of anti-money laundering legislation that was ever passed. It really actually successfully cleaned up the American banking sector. So all too often when we see these kleptocratic networks, they're not necessarily using American banks. They're using plenty of other Western industries, but the American banking sector, all things considered, is relatively clean. That was a relatively successful move. The Patriot Act also targeted a range of other American industries to require basic anti-money laundering considerations. And these were the industries like real estate, like private equity, like hedge funds, like the art market, on and on, that there were concerns about being used for illicit or dirty money networks, but that wasn't the main focus. The main focus was the American banking sector. And what ended up happening was a couple months after the Patriot Act passed, the Treasury Department, the Bush Treasury Department, unfortunately issued a series of exemptions for the real estate market, for private equity, for hedge funds, and on, saying, oh, these new requirements for anti-money laundering checks, you don't have to actually implement these right away. We're going to study the issue to make sure we're not cutting these industries off at the knees. You can see the logic to it. They want to understand what these new regulations were going to do to these industries. The problem was that they said these exemptions were going to be temporary. That's how they describe them, temporary exemptions for real estate and private equity and on and on. And it has now been 20 years of these temporary exemptions from basic anti-money laundering checks being in place. And we have seen what has happened. No longer is it the American banking sector. Now it's American real estate, tens of trillions of dollars, perfectly freely and anonymously available to kleptocrats around the world. The American private investment sector, perfectly freely and legally available to kleptocrats around the world, worth trillions of dollars in assets, all of it completely untraceable, all of it completely anonymous. We have seen these industries develop and explode really into the go-to destinations for kleptocrats, regardless of the country of origin, coming to the U.S. to hide and launder their wealth in these industries that, as you said, have enjoyed these carve-outs for decades. Now, I certainly not my definition of temporary.
One of the other pieces of this that to me was pretty astounding is the fact that, in any complex financial system, you need some grease. And in this complex financial system, the grease is a whole cadre of lawyers from, relatively prestigious white shoe firms, but that will more than gladly support your efforts to build an anonymous shell company, make an investment to buy your beachfront property in Malibu. And that just is okay. Like the American Bar Association. In fact, one of the most astounding aspects of the book was when you mentioned that one of the lawyers involved in this kleptocracy was the president of the American Bar Association. Can you talk about the role that the legal industry in this country has played in facilitating this kind of transaction and why it hasn't been addressed yet?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I describe in the book, I describe American lawyers and law firms. And again, these are the most prestigious law firms in the country, the most white shoe law firms in the country, in Washington and New York and elsewhere. I describe them as the best friends that kleptocrats, regardless of the source of their wealth or the origin may be, as the best friends these kleptocrats have. And that's for a
Mm.
range of reasons. When we're talking about lawyers and law firms, I think a lot of folks still understandably think that the services they provide are simply those that we see in the courtroom. Defending clients, making sure there's equal representation under the law, and certainly everyone in the U.S. is entitled to equal representation under the law. I'm not talking about the representation they receive from these firms in court. I'm talking about all of the other services these lawyers and law firms now provide. Because all too often, it's the lawyers and law firms that are setting up the shell companies themselves. The kleptocrat is not picking up the phone or going to Delaware, him or herself, and setting up the shell companies. They hire an American lawyer. They hire an American law firm to do that for themselves. They set up the shell company networks. They set up the real estate purchases. They set up the meetings with the art gallery owners. They set up the meetings with the auction house owners. Beyond that, they are the ones that are lobbying for increasing offshoring provisions, increasing pro-kleptocracy policies in places like Washington, in places like Delaware, in places like Nevada, to entrench and strengthen these offshoring networks. They've increasingly become PR representatives for these figures as well, going into public fora, going on TV, again, going to policymakers and legislators in Washington and elsewhere, and describing their oligarchic clients, not as the best friends of dictators, but as businessmen, as philanthropists. They are organizing the donations to nonprofit centers to transform these oligarchs into tycoons and philanthropists and moguls and on and on and on. And then, oh, by the way, they're doing all this while simultaneously intimidating investigative journalists that might be looking into this. This is maybe a conversation for another time, but there's been a very real and growing concern in the US and elsewhere about the ability of foreign oligarchs, foreign kleptocrats, to specifically target and censor investigative journalists in places like the US or Canada or the UK or elsewhere. You have this whole range of services that American lawyers and law firms now provide. And I will say, just to close up, we were talking just a moment ago about the carve-outs that industry after industry in the US provides. For American lawyers and law firms, there has never been any even basic anti-money laundering requirements or checks on that sector whatsoever. And this is in spite of international agreements that the U.S. itself has signed. All which is to say, these lawyers and law firms, they don't need to ask any questions about the source of that wealth when they're setting up the shell companies, when they're setting up the trust, setting up the real estate purchases, when they are opening their own bank accounts to these kleptocratic clients themselves. They don't have to do any due diligence whatsoever on whose money they're working with or to what end they're working with. And I will say, if folks want... Again, it's a terrible subject. It's a very depressing subject, but it's at least worth a laugh. Highly recommend Googling the 60 Minutes video sting expose from 2016, just a few years ago, where folks from 60 Minutes posed as a corrupt foreign official coming to American lawyers and American law firms, asking them over and over and over again what the best ways to go about hiding their money in the U.S. is. As memory serves, there was only one lawyer that turned them away. All the rest said, please come in. We'll set everything up for you. We'll show you how to do it. And one of those who was willing to help was, you're absolutely right, the president of the American Bar Association, which has been one of the primary lobbying groups against any kind of transparency, against any kind of end to this American kleptocracy.
That's obscene. You talked about the victims abroad who are having the substrate for their healthcare systems and their new roads and their daily bread stripped out from underneath them, being shipped off to Russian nesting dolls of shell companies to invest in art or apartments abroad, right? And they deserve our attention and our focus. And at the same time, there are also people who suffer the consequences of this right here at home in the United States. And the way that looks is, well, the money that ought to be taxed from this income doesn't actually ever get taxed because it's hidden so well. The rental market in major cities gets artificially puffed up because people are going to pay exorbitant amounts of money for properties that they buy that they can afford because they're really trying to puff up the cost because it allows them to launder yet more money. It looks like having major buildings in towns like Cleveland, as you talk about, being bought up with the promise of being rejuvenated that never actually happens. It looks like watching factories get bought up with the promise of offering safe, healthy union jobs that just never really come to pass. And so there are victims here at home. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and maybe what the consequences have been for lower and middle income Americans because of our addiction and our facilitation of global kleptocracy?
Yeah, no, this is where things come home. as you may be able to tell from my accent, an American. I wrote a book about the United States of America. I wanted to write a book for especially American audiences to understand this specifically American transformation, and beyond that, what that's meant for the rest of us here in the country and elsewhere. There's two primary case studies in the book. One is the son of the longest standing dictator in the world from this country in Africa, who I think checks all the boxes of what we think about modern oligarchs, modern kleptocrats. He had the $30 million mansion in Malibu. He had this fleet of supercars. He had models on his arms and private jets and all those elements of kind of conspicuous consumption that, as well as the world's biggest collection of Michael Jackson memorabilia, some of which he's whisked out of the country now, and I was unfortunately not able to see. But the other case study that I wrote on was kind of the flip side of that, or the bookend to that. And this was a Ukrainian oligarch who was overseeing a $5.5 billion Ponzi scheme in Ukraine, really helping gut that country's economy and more broadly destabilizing things and incentivizing this Russian invasion that we've seen over the past month. But he didn't go to New York. He didn't go to Miami. He didn't go to Malibu to hide all his money. He went to places like Cleveland, Ohio. He went to small towns in Kentucky and West Virginia and Illinois and purchased commercial real estate buildings. He purchased steel mills. He purchased manufacturing plants, many of which are these economic lifebloods of these local communities. And frankly, many of which we would never in 1,000 years associate with modern kleptocracy or modern oligarchs. We don't think of small towns like Ashland, Kentucky. We don't think of small towns like Harvard, Illinois, that are little specks on the map as part of these broader transnational money laundering networks. But as we now know, as the DOJ alleges, this oligarch and his team swooped in. They didn't necessarily disclose where the money was coming from. They certainly didn't disclose it was part of this gargantuan Ponzi scheme. They came in promising revitalization. They came in promising new jobs. They came in promising a return to the kind of economic heyday that the American Rust Belt, the American Midwest has had, decades behind it. One of the Cleveland City Council members, he said, when they came in, it was like bringing water to a very thirsty man. Again, I don't begrudge any of the people in Cleveland or these small towns from accepting this money, from being overly excited about what this money may be doing. But as we now know, those promises of revitalization were not worth the paper they were written on. They were just a means of opening the door, in addition to all the anonymous shell companies and other anonymous purchases that were involved. As American authorities, as Ukrainian investigators have all detailed, these were just part of a far broader international money laundering network. They just wanted to have the assets on paper that they could point to and say the money went here and then it went elsewhere. And it has this gargantuan cycle that continues spiraling out and out and out. It's, I guess, a relatively convoluted story. The book goes into far more detail about. But the reality on the ground is these buildings in downtown Cleveland continued to decline. Tenants had to move elsewhere. These, most tragically for me, the steel plants in these small towns, these manufacturing plants in these small towns, not only did the jobs not come back, not only was there no new investment that came in, they continued to decline. They had this kind of slow march to implosion. In some cases, literally, there's this one storied steel plant in eastern Ohio that began falling apart to such an effect that beams were just falling on steel workers there, or the blast furnace was actually blowing up and singeing the skin off of American steel workers. I mean, this is blue collar America. This is the heart of the American economy right there in the American Midwest and the Rust Belt. And suddenly there's actual physical damage, not just to these plants and factories, but to the actual workers on the ground, sending them to hospitals, obviously eliminating the jobs, and then slowly destroying these actual, again, economic crown jewels. So instead of the promised revitalization coming in, it just accelerated that decline that much more. And we see closure after closure and, that much more destitution as a result of it right here in the United States.
Yeah. That story was so hard to hear. I was the health director for the city of Detroit, and Detroit, very similar to Cleveland, has had such challenges transitioning as far as the nature of our economy has changed with time. A lot of that because of globalization, and to see the neo-colonialism, as you called it, come back and hit these people yet again is just so devastating. The other part of this, right, is that we in this country have had this profound polarization that I think in part has been driven by the mistrust of elites in elite institutions. And one of the things that I found astounding was that so many of the names on these prestigious institutions that we see, whether they're universities or the Council on Foreign Relations, donors who are giving are kleptocrats who are using their donations to launder their ill-begotten gains. And to launder their reputations as kleptocrats in the first place. And I want to ask you, why is that even possible? Like, how are these institutions that exist in a prestige economy allowed to go on and take kleptocratic money without actually having to do basic due diligence about where the money's coming from? And then what is your sense about how that has contributed to the mistrust that people have in these institutions because of the ways that they're funded?
Well, I'll take the second part of that first. I think. I mean, it is absolutely contributed, and completely unsurprisingly so. I mean, why wouldn't you look askance or with a suspect look at these nominally prestigious institutions? And again, we're talking the cream of the crop: the Harvards and the Yales, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Guggenheim Museum, the MoMA Museum in New York, the Kennedy Center in D.C. This is really the heart and center of American soft power, or American cultural power, whatever term you'd like to use, that have, as we've seen over the past few decades, have opened their doors up time and time and time again to oligarchic and kleptocratic figures from around the world. Now, again, my background is in the Russian and post-Soviet space, so I focused most exclusively on oligarchs from places like Russia, places like Ukraine, places like Azerbaijan, places like Kazakhstan, looking specifically at those figures and how the Harvards, the Yales, the Cornells, the museums, the nonprofit centers, these cultural institutions were welcoming with wide open arms all of this oligarchic and suspect money coming in. And just being truly kind of gobsmacked by how we saw this. It wasn't just one institution doing this one time. It was over and over and over again. And as we know, this has happened from oligarchic figures from around the world, whether it's in North Africa or Southeast Asia or China or South America. Over and again, these universities and museums and nonprofits have been more than willing to take some of this money. And again, we're talking millions and millions of dollars, take this money, and in so doing, transform these kleptocratic oligarchic figures into moguls, into philanthropists, and then beyond that, opening doors for them to policymakers and tastemakers right here in the U.S. To take the first question, the reason they're able to do this is because, similar to lawyers in the U.S., there's never been any requirement for American nonprofits, for American educational institutes, for American museums, for American cultural centers, and on, to do any kind of due diligence checks whatsoever. Not only is it not legally required, but there's not even any kind of best practices in terms of industry-wide or nonprofit-wide circles. And then beyond that, there's, the way to phrase it is, if Harvard sees Yale doing this, there's no reason for them to not open their own doors for this. It is a kind of nonprofit race to the bottom to attract all of this, again, clearly illicit, clearly kleptocratic wealth, to open their doors. And I will say, we're speaking here at the end of March 2022. We are finally starting to see some of the damage, some of the reputational damage to these institutes from that. And again, so much of that is couched in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But what we have seen over the past few weeks is really unprecedented criticism coming into some of these nonprofits, the Harvards, the Yales, the MoMAs, the Guggenheims, for all these years they spent willingly taking and using that oligarchic wealth. And it wasn't money laundering per se they were engaged in. It was reputation laundering. That's the political science term for it. Again, transforming these figures and beyond that, these regimes into exactly what they want to be described as: successful businessmen that are on a path to democracy, that are only interested in building bridges with Western partners. And, oh, by the way, don't look too far into where we got this money from or what we may be doing with it.
That's devastating. Over and over again in the book, you identify opportunities that regulators could have had to solve the problem that they chose not to take. And in so many ways, this is a policy failure. And hopefully we're starting to see some change. Can you detail specifically what would need to be done to really shut down and turn off the spigot of ill-begotten kleptocratic money into our country? And then, if we're making any progress toward that?
So I will say, for as depressing a topic this can be, and certainly is in the book, it may be a surprise for folks to hear that the book actually ends on something of an optimistic note. And I've certainly been accused of being too optimistic in the past, and I'll own it, because at a certain point, optimism is all you have.
You want to be optimistic, right? In the end, what are we all doing here if we don't believe it could be better?
It can't get much worse, I'll tell you that much.
Right,
but I will say there are a couple things that I want to point to, some that made it into the book, some that have happened since the book actually came out, that I do think kind of buttress that optimism. So early last year, the U.S. finally passed legislation that will effectively eliminate the formation of anonymous shell companies. Now, again, we're waiting for the final language for that to kind of come out, so we don't know what kind of exemptions or loopholes may be there. But finally, Congress passed legislation over President Trump's veto that will effectively eliminate the formation of anonymous shell companies, which, again, are really the bedrock of this kleptocratic transformation of all these offshoring networks in the U.S. And that was a really remarkable moment. I don't want to undersell how important that was. We've been arguing for it for years and years, and it finally came to pass, and that's absolutely a reason to celebrate. but it's not a panacea, and you can't stop there. The Biden administration came in with these kind of renewed, I don't know, pledges or claims to finally be addressing America's kleptocratic transformation itself. And we have actually seen some of the fruits of that thus far. The Biden administration elevated corruption to a core national security threat. And then just a few months ago, released an unprecedented anti-corruption strategy document, the first of its kind in American history. And if folks do want to, it's relatively short. I mean, it's 40 pages. It's not overly detailed, overly dry. I don't know. I say relatively.
Casey, I'm trying to get him to read your book first, okay? Let me read the book first and then go read the 40-page policy document.
Let me summarize what's in this. I will say, because they didn't pull any punches whatsoever. You know, I couldn't have written a better document. They go directly after the American industries. They go directly after the American policies. They go directly after American lawyers, American real estate, American private equity, and pledge that finally the executive branch will end some of these loopholes and some of these exemptions that have allowed this transformation to take place in these industries itself. Now, all of that is to say, so much of this has been just rhetoric thus far. And I don't want to get kind of over my skis and saying we've accomplished plenty already. So much of this, what we've seen out of the Biden administration, what we've seen out of Congress as well, is bills have been introduced and they haven't yet gone anywhere. Or for the Biden administration, this new policy document is out there, but these policies haven't been implemented as of yet. So we're continuing to watch. We're continuing to pressure. We're continuing to highlight and make sure that there's this broader awareness now, not only of America's transformation into the center of the broader offshoring world, but the very real national security concerns that we're seeing play out in real time in places like Ukraine, right, as these networks have been able to develop. So much of it has been kind of a rhetorical shift out of Washington over the past year. We have to see that translate into actual policy, and we're going to be pressuring until it gets there. I have no idea if we're living through an inflection point right now. It feels like it at times, but it's going to be one of those things in a year's time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time. We'll have to see just how much progress we've actually made. But again, my cautious optimism is it hasn't been snuffed out just yet.
The only kind of optimism I like is the cautious kind. So I really appreciate you you closing us out on that note. I want to just finish on a personal note. This is a really brave book. You don't pull punches and you name names. And, you know, I know that that journalism is becoming an increasingly hazardous profession. Have you faced any backlash personally for this work?
Well, I am fortunate for many reasons to be an American journalist, and again, writing for primarily American audiences. You know, I'm not going to lie, I've certainly faced legal pressure in the past that hasn't translated to any formal lawsuits, although I know plenty of my British colleagues that work in this space who've done phenomenal work on the topic of modern kleptocracy have faced lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. I consider myself very fortunate that it hasn't gotten to that point, because we know these oligarchs have far deeper pockets than any of us. And then beyond that, I haven't faced any kind of physical threats as all investigative journalists across the West and elsewhere have continued and facing for now years, to say nothing of the incredibly brave journalists in places like Egypt, in places like Russia, in places like Kazakhstan, that have to deal day in, day out with these anti-democratic regimes in power that are dedicated to, again, enriching themselves, enriching their family members, and enriching their close circles. So no, I don't want to claim that I've faced any kind of particular threats. I simply stand in awe, frankly, of those journalists elsewhere that deal with far worse than anything that I have to deal with as an American journalist. I don't know. I don't know how they do it, and my hats go off to them.
Well, I'm grateful to them and to you. That was Casey Michel. He's author of the incredible new book, American Kleptocracy. If you want to understand all of the ways that ill-begotten foreign money are being hidden in our society in ways that are too big to see, I highly recommend the book. It's a really entertaining read. There are lots of parts of it that we didn't even get to, like the connections with Donald Trump, that are a really big part of the story. And so I hope that folks will check it out. It'll be available on my bookshop, and I'm sure anywhere you get your books. Casey, thank you so much for taking the time both to write the book, to educate us, and to share your perspective on it with me here today. Thank you again.
Well, thanks so much for being here.